Hi folks, you're at Taskless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the different concepts of time and place, as in the here and now, the time and space you're in this very minute, concepts of time retrospectively, concepts of time as in, again, right now, and concepts of time into the future. Now, different races, you may not be aware, but different races perceive these things very differently. Now, I thought that everybody pretty much perceived time in the same way, and that I was surprised as a young man when I started business traveling around the world that actually different societies perceive time and space, and again, the past, the present, the future. They perceive them very differently. And the ability to perceive the future requires a degree of, scientific sort of, rational reasoning, scientific knowledge, but it also requires the ability for abstract thought. So the ability to see into the future, maybe not hundreds of years or something, but say, okay, if I plant the crops now, I'll be able to harvest them, in the spring or something, those sorts of things. So, or if I bring my livestock, say my herd of cows, and I put them in a shed under cover in winter, then more of them will survive than if I leave them out in the fields, and these sorts of things. So the ability to in an abstract sense determine what do I need to do today to improve outcomes in the future. Now, you'd think that everybody, again, I just assumed, everybody thought more or less the same way. I assumed just straight out competence was the difference. Why was Africa constantly poor? Why were the white countries, by contrast, rich and so on? Was it, and I just assumed that the difference in outcome, which was stark even when I was a young man, the difference in outcome was because one, the white people were just more efficient and less corrupt, that sort of stuff. Now, those are issues, by the way, but I hadn't realized that the concepts of time were different. Now, say in the case of Aboriginal Australians, they were Stone Age hunter-gatherers when the white folks ponied up certainly in Eastern Australia anyway, in the 1780s. So now we're talking, more 10,000 years plus in evolutionary development, technical and organizational. Now, there tends to be a focus just on the technical, that the white people were more technically more advanced. But there's also a huge organizational component here, the ability of white people to perceive the future. Now, what was considered strange, and the white people couldn't seem to get their heads around it, nor could the Aborigines understand the abstract thought that the white people were employing here. But the Aborigines had what's called the dream time. Now, the dream time is what happened, 5 minutes ago and going back in time. So they've got a very, they look backwards in time in order to measure time or to consider time or conceive it. They do have a, but it's right here now, this very minute, and it doesn't really go much beyond that. So the planning for the future requires a degree of abstract thought, but also requires the concept of a future. And here, the Aboriginal people had what we would reasonably describe as an absolutely minimal understanding, kind of why do you need to consider the future? Now, bear in mind, they're Stone Age hunter-gatherers, so the idea that they had, running herds of cattle or anything like that, vast areas under cultivation, so that's all bullshit. There's been a recent attempt, propaganda, radical propaganda attempt to say, no, the Aborigines lived in large towns and they were a super advanced society. They invented this first space rocket and all sorts of stuff like that. But the reality is they were Stone Age people. So there was approximately 10,000 years separating the white people that came along, the British in this case, in Eastern Australia, and the Aborigines. Now, even if you look at, say, the Incas and the Aztecs, it's not that they didn't have a concept of the future in the same way that white people did, but their concept was more what here and now, what can immediately be accomplished. So you put one stone on top of another, and that then creates a Mayan temple. But they clearly had the ability to think ahead, but not in the same abstract concept that white people did. So, for example, they hadn't developed the wheel, and there are a whole lot of technical developments that you think would have been developed alongside the agricultural capacity they had, and they clearly had that, and also alongside the concept of, or alongside the architectural engineering, and in some cases even mathematical capability that you could see in the building of their own pyramids and various religious buildings and so on that they developed. But the idea of the abstract thought about planning ahead at a particularly technical level, they didn't seem to have that. Now, coming to why do white people uniquely have this capability? If we go to the Asian people, and I assumed they were the same, but as a young man, I found, much to my surprise, by the way, that they saw time very differently. Not that they were incapable of thinking ahead or incapable of abstract thought, they were, but they saw it as an overall never-ending continuum rather than what can we accomplish today. And I found this very frustrating in, say, business negotiations and discussions, that they saw a wider continuum of social prestige and things like that in a way that was irrelevant, if not impeded, getting something done sort of in the shorter term. So whereas my thinking was not, without being very much a Western sort of guy, my thinking was not that the longer term is irrelevant. It's not. It is relevant, but we get there in steps of accomplishment. And this is something. So I was trying to steer this is Asian guys and this Chinese in this case, by the way. Trying to steer them to see that the goals they accomplished along the way were stepping stones and more important than the time continuum that they seem to see, because the time continuum did take into account the accomplishment of today, or the stepping stones of accomplishments. So this was something that was uniquely Western, and I hadn't realised that again, preparing for the future, for example, planting crops today that you can then harvest in the following season, those sorts of things. And then, well, how do I then store those crops? Because if I just harvest them and I leave them sort of lying around, then they're going to spoil in the rain. And so I need to have some sort of storage facility. Okay, well, if I do that, then the rats and the mice will come and eat the grain that I've stored. So I need to have a secure building, and I need to have, I don't know, a cat to chase the mice away, and so on and so forth. So the thought and the planning and the forward thinking, which is multifaceted, plant crops, harvest crops, have to move crops to storage areas. Storage area must be secure. Need this, need that, and there's a whole lot of steps in the planning. Now, it's not that other cultures, Asian culture, for example, didn't have that capacity, but they saw that in the wider, longer term time continuum, time immemorial, rather than stepping stones and sets of accomplishment. That was a uniquely Western thing, and again, much to my surprise. Now, if we look at the Black African experience, which is again Stone Age hunter-gatherer, or very, very much in that direction, there was still 8,000 to 10,000 years that separated white Western man from the most of the black folks in Africa. We're talking back like the 1600s when things were sort of kicking off along there, and this was something again that the white people were surprised by, the inability of the black people to plan ahead. Now, even if the whites would arrive annually, say that depending on the seasons and the the wind and the climatic conditions in terms of storms and everything. So it was they would only come at certain times of the year when the winds were favourable with their sailing ships. They would come back and they would leave. They would build a perfectly good whatever, and then they would come back the next year to find the whole thing in ruins. It had been torn to pieces. The black people had stolen all the building materials, and they'd left behind animals for milking, cows for milking or something. That they'd killed them for meat, and then there was no milk. So very much this idea, well, today, here, right now, what are we going to do? And let's. I'm hungry now. I'll kill that animal to eat it. Well, hold on a minute. Don't do that, because that cow will provide milk for all year round. So why kill the cow? Why kill the goose that lays the golden egg? That requires abstract thought and being able to perceive the future and think into the future. And very few, I don't think any hunter-gatherer societies really thought that way. Now, say in Britain or Western Europe, but take Britain, where there's very harsh climatic cycles that you don't see in places like Australia and Africa, or most of Asia, or certainly not around the equator, where you have agricultural produce, trees producing bananas and this and that all year round. You don't have that in Europe. But there was still a hunter-gatherer population in Europe that didn't have any agriculture. So depending on what whose sort of history you look at, or archaeological history that you look at, somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 years ago in Western Europe, the idea of sedentary agriculture started to develop. Prior to that, it was hunter-gatherer. Now, again, depending on whose numbers you look at, the entire British Isles had, hunter-gatherer days had less than 100,000 people. But once agriculture sort of developed, and you had these substantial agricultural areas, not only with livestock, but crop planting and harvesting and tilling the soil and somewhat sophisticated, I guess, agricultural sector. It's still you're still looking at maybe, I don't know, very early Iron Age, Bronze Age, that sort of thing. But by that stage, by that time, the population had gone from less than 100,000 to somewhere around 2 million in the British Isles. I mean, some estimates are even higher than that. But this takes, again, a certain amount of planning. Now, why is there a difference? Do people living in the equator in Africa, they think, well, we can get food all year round here. I mean, who cares? But the population, the population of Africa, for example, was quite substantial, even though there was a hunter-gatherer sort of society. It was a huge number of people relative to other parts of the world. So just living off the land as hunter-gatherers was enough to really get by. Could it have been better? Well, but there was no real incentive for that. Now, in the northern climates where there's a harsh winter and that sort of thing, if you're going to survive, I mean, the hunter-gatherers did survive, but if you're going to survive, then you need to plan ahead. But there are other factors here. The sanctity of life, for example, and this is pre-Christian era, but it was considered to be, there's got to be a way we can stop all these people who die during winter, whether it be from malnutrition or the cold or diseases or inadequate diets or something like that. How can we stop that? We need to be better prepared with the sort of food, the type of food. We need to have better storage. We need to, because I don't want my kids to die. I don't want my relatives to die. I don't want my husband or wife to die there. So there's a much greater sanctity on life that was, again, pre-Christian, but a much greater sanctity. Life was important. I don't want the people in the village or my relatives to die. That wasn't the same in a lot of these other societies. If somebody died, And it was treated with, not in every single society, by the way. There's still ancestor worship was going on in Chinese societies so it still does today, by the way. But there wasn't there was for certainly in the black cultures, and certainly in a lot of the Pacific Island tribal type cultures, the death of your relatives, your friends, your tribal members was just a shoulder shrug. You see it in India, by the way. An Indian sort of truck driver or somebody will kill 3 or 4 people on the road. And they just shrug their shoulders. Like, oh, yeah, just a daily event. In India, you can walk across dead bodies in the street. Now that's someone's, son, brother, husband, relative, cousin, or whatever. Nobody cares. You just walk over the dead body. That's how they are. I mean, you barely know. It's just a piece of trash on the street. So it's perceived very differently. And the idea of not wanting, trying to prevent and limit people dying, particularly if you're relatives or your tribal members, that sort of thing, that was very much a part of the focus. So we're not just looking at organizational differences or climatic differences. There's a whole lot of attitudinal differences that are built into this, but the ability to acquire the abstract thought of the future, thinking, well, I need to accomplish this goal in order to improve the situation. This can be digging irrigation ditches so you can put more land under cultivation. It can be building a stone wall fence to stop the wind from eroding your pastures and your fields. It can be building roads or whatever, and later on things like windmills and water wheels and so on. It can involve, but a whole lot of planning and organization and the abstract thought. Now, if I divert the water from that river to here, I can then do that, which will then allow me to put together, I'll be able to double the amount of fields I can bring under cultivation. Then I can do this and that and so on. These sort of things aren't stuff that other cultures did, Asian cultures did, but they're largely not the same sort of thing. That organizational structure that we see in the West today, and this is something again that I noticed as a young man just starting out in business, traveling, the level of difference between organizational structure and the ability to abstract think. What do I need organizationally? What do I need to put into place today to make this accomplished, so I can accomplish that tomorrow or next season or next year? And this sort of building block organizational structuring and having it around goals and objectives was something I found that other cultures, including the Asian one, by the way, just didn't have, or certainly nowhere near to the extent that the Western man did. Now, maybe I was a little bit further advanced in that abstract thought capability or not, but the thing was I didn't find it elsewhere. And most people around, I only ever found that thought in other Western countries. The only country where I found that thought process to any extent was in Japan. But again, they saw it not around the goal, but around the wider continuum. Again, the Asian thought process. They did it rather successfully, though, far more successfully than any other Asian culture. But nonetheless, so when we look at time and the ability, why are black, why are the African blacks, no matter where they go, even if it's hundreds of years outside of Africa, for example, the Americans, the African Americans, they've been multiple 10 generations in America, surrounded by white people, surrounded by white technology, surrounded by white planning, surrounded by white education, and yet they still behave almost exactly the same as they would if they were in Africa. There are exceptions, of course, but and we see this all over, wherever black people are imported in quantity, whether it's into Afghanistan, for example, they're a tribal Stone Age society. Once you import these people into an advanced society, they are unable to think and comprehend and acquire this abstract thought. So why was it uniquely the abstract thought? Now, so why did the West have it? I use Britain, the British Isles, as a baseline example. So 6 to 8 thousand years ago, they start having sedentary farming communities, transitioning from hunter-gatherer, and they start putting together if you like, the organizational structures, animal husbandry, planting crops, tilling fields, all that sort of stuff, irrigation and the like. They start putting that together, and they advance, to where white people sort of are today. But their societies very quickly grew in number. They hit a ceiling or a threshold there, but and bounced around, sort of somewhat in that sort of time. Like, for example, if you have 2 million to 3 million people in Britain, for England, let's take England for example, in the time Julius Caesar was around, so say 55 BC, then you come to the year 1700, for example, the population is maybe 7 million. So the population has grown very, very slowly over 1,700 years. Then you get this huge takeoff around the time of the agricultural revolution, transitioning into the industrial revolution. So one of the schools of thought is that the people in again, using the British Isles as an example, the people who were incapable of that organizational structure of planting crops, animal husband, sedentary living, and incapable of moving from the hunter-gatherer situation, they died off, and only the people with the brain power to have abstract thought survived, and they're the ones now that's possible, I guess, but it doesn't really sort of, I don't think that suffices as a complete explanation. I think there's more to that. There's other schools of thought that say, was diet improved in Western Europe, and they had all year round crops, for example, barley bread in winter and things like that. That because their diet improved, then their brain power improved, their cognitive abilities improved, and that was the launching pad. I don't buy that as an explanation. I think the differences are genetic, and I think the ability for abstract thought, even when you teach it to somebody and show them, lead them by the hand and show them, Africans I'm talking about here, they still don't get it. Now some will, but basically they still don't get it. Nor does every white person get it, incidentally. But this idea that it's maybe diet related, climate related, or that these people died off. I mean, maybe some of those do have merit to say, but I think it at its core level, it's genetic. Why are some people capable of abstract thought, or societies and cultures and races capable of this level of abstract thought, which is an absolute baseline requirement if you're going to have that organizational structure to plan ahead. Why do some have it? Why do some have it on a long time continuum, but others have it on a goal, objective by objective accomplishment? Only white societies have that. Why is that so? You're being a tasteless today, your Pushback Channel. Thank you for listening.